Hey everyone, welcome to the Them Before Us podcast. I'm your host, Jen Friesen, and we have a great conversation today with one of our authors from the new book, Pro-Child Politics. Today we're going to talk to Dan Caldwell, who's a public policy advisor for defense priorities. Previously, he was the vice president of foreign policy for Stand Together and the vice president of the Center for Renewing America. Dan also served as the executive director of Concerned Veterans for America. Dan is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps and the Iraq War. Following his initial training, Dan first served at the presidential retreat at Camp David and then deployed to Iraq with the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. Following his service in the Marines, Dan worked for Representative David Schweikert, focusing on veterans and defense issues. Dan, thanks so much for your time and joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me on.
All right, first, we're going to get into the book. We're going to talk about foreign policy and all the meaty parts of your expertise. But first, I'd love to just hear from you where you grew up, how you grew up, what brought you to be a person who wanted to enlist and serve America in our armed forces.
So I was born in Northern California, but I only lived there for 3 months. Then I moved to Massachusetts, and I was there for a few years. But for me, Arizona's home. That's where I grew up. That's where my family still is. That's where my kids were born. And I still consider that home, even though I live and work in the DC area. And so growing up, I was really interested in military history. I had a grandfather that was a paratrooper in the Army. And I loved watching the History Channel when they actually had history documentaries and not just shows about aliens or, finding stuff in empty storage lockers or pawn shops. So I just was always devouring that. And so I always kind of, by the time I was in my teenage years, felt that I was going to pursue a military career. I went to a Jesuit all-boys high school and graduated. It was the early years of the Iraq War. And I was a little burned out from school. And so I wasn't ready to do college yet. And I had a very good friend from high school that was in Iraq with the Army. And I was talking to him, and I was like, I got to get in the fight, essentially. And so I enlisted in the Marine Corps and enlisted in the infantry. My first 2 years, I wound up serving at the presidential retreat at Camp David as part of the Guard Force up there. And that was an excellent experience. Served a lot of great Marines.
What's for lay people, what is Camp David?
So Camp David is the presidential retreat. It's a secluded compound in Western Maryland, just south of the Pennsylvania border. It's probably about 20 minutes, 30 minutes away from Gettysburg, where the big Civil War battle was fought. It's where presidents go to relax, but also where they go to do meetings they don't want a lot of visibility on. There's been a lot of famous peace treaties and peace accords signed there. It's where President Biden went after his disastrous debate to meet in with his family. Mm-hmm. And presidents like to go to Camp David because it's actually more secluded and secure than the White House, and there's fewer prying eyes. And so it was a fantastic duty station. It was a great place to be a Marine. And got a lot of great training, served with a lot of great Marines, as I said. And I left Camp David prepared for the next chapter, which was going to the fleet, that we call it. And so 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, you said my bio, and it's with them that I deployed to Iraq.
What is it like to experience American foreign policy on the ground as someone wearing a uniform, and then now you've had a lot of experience in public policy and you've worked in a number of different places. Now you hear a lot of people talk about it. Someone on the radio where I could say, our foreign policy should be this, this, this. I've barely been out of the United States. I really don't know much about it. Is that very difficult? Is it frustrating? Or do you just kind of wish people understood more about it?
This is actually, I think, a really good question. And it kind of actually helps a bit explain kind of my journey and how I adopted my views on American foreign policy. So when you're a lower level officer or enlisted NCO like I am, you see a lot of things firsthand and you experience the impacts and the end results of the foreign policy that America ultimately chooses to pursue. The other people who experience it are the people in the countries that we pursue military action or other types of non-military foreign policy tools. But you ultimately at the tip of the spear of the implementation of America's foreign policy. But admittedly, oftentimes you don't see, I don't want to say the bigger picture, because you actually can see the bigger picture sometimes when you're on the ground, but you don't understand how you got to that place initially. It's not explained to you. Like when I was in Iraq, leading up into that, nobody in the Marine Corps explained to us how a group of neoconservatives came together in the late 90s and ultimately started implementing a plan to get the United States to invade Iraq even prior to 9/11. And that there was a whole campaign executed under the Bush administration. It was bipartisan. It wasn't just Republicans, a lot of Democrats as well too, to essentially push the United States in the war with Iraq, inflate the threat posed by Saddam Hussein, overstate what was at stake in Iraq for the United States. And so that was not obviously explained to us. And so learning after I got out of the Marine Corps, as I got more involved in public policy and working for a member of Congress, learning how that works at that level, it helped connect a lot of dots for me. And really, in some ways, I would say, I don't use this term lightly, but radicalized me. And it made me want to go out and help connect people to how we make foreign policy impacts a lot of Americans often in a very negative way. And that there are consequences to saying all the time, we need to bomb this country, we need to keep troops there. A lot of Americans, particularly in the policymaking class, are disconnected from those costs. It's just a number on a paper for them, whether it's the number of troops or the financial costs. And so I saw the actual costs firsthand, and I saw a lot of my friends and family bear those costs in one way or another. And, for my family, it was the constant stress of me being in a war zone. For a lot of my friends, some who were injured in the service, having to bear the costs of those injuries for the rest of their lives, and then knowing Marines that ultimately paid the ultimate sacrifice and the impact that that's had on their families and friends and their communities. Too many people in our leadership are completely ignorant of those costs or don't want to think about them. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that to be honest, angers me, because they haven't felt that. And a lot of times, to kind of sum it up, when I'm thinking about, okay, the United States is about to do X in foreign policy. So whether it's deploy more troops to Iraq or Syria, or deploy more troops to the Middle East, I'm thinking about the grunts now. They're going to have to worry about an attack by an Iranian proxy. I'm worried about, sailors on the USS Cole, which was bombed in 2000 by Al-Qaeda and now is back in the Middle East, preparing for a potential Iranian attack on Israel. What happens if an anti-ship missile hits them? And then even beyond that, having to work long hours on a very cramped and noisy ship, is that those experiences will impact those soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen for the rest of their lives. And I don't think a lot of people truly understand and absorb that, because we don't have as large a veteran population as we once had, because the World War II generation has passed away. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the biggest thing for me. And I know that was a long answer to your question, but I think it's important to kind of walk through all that and how it's helped evolve my thinking.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so many of us either have had, so my grandfather served in World War II, and I had another grandfather who was stationed in Hawaii during Korea, but was not deployed. But that's about as close as, I don't have a lot of people close to me with military experience. But many people maybe have friends who are in it, but it's not a huge part of the U.S. population. So it seems like we're basing a lot of our thoughts on foreign policy and the military based on what we see in the news, what we see going on in other countries. Like you've kind of pointed out a little bit, both sides of the political spectrum drumming up different things based on maybe an agenda that's already been laid out long time ago. And I think too, there's just a huge human cost. Thinking about, I'd love if you have a story maybe of someone maybe just humanizing, like a soldier deployed in Iraq. Okay, but there are people there. There's men, women, children, families, maybe someone you interacted with. I'll just share a quick story. Recently, we switched over our Wi-Fi, and a guy came over a tech came to set it up. Got to talking to him a little bit. He was an Afghan translator who had just been rescued out of Afghanistan with the withdrawal under Biden-Harris. And it was kind of that same scenario of, thankfully, he had connections, and the people he was close to, who he had served with here, did everything they could to get him and his family, his immediate family, to the United States to be safe. And so now he has a job here. But it was a humanizing moment for something that I just saw on the news. This seems horrible. I can't believe we're withdrawing in this way. But it really opens your eyes to the humans that are impacted by foreign policy.
Yeah, I think the story that I tell in the chapter at the beginning of a Marine that I served with as part of the Presidential Support Program, Derek Wyatt. Derek served with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, and he was deployed to Sangin, Afghanistan towards the end of 2010. And Sangin was, at that time, probably the worst part of Afghanistan. And 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines would eventually have the highest casualty rate of any Marine battalion deployed to Afghanistan. In December 2010, Derek was killed in action, and his wife, Kate, was pregnant at the time. And the day after Derek was killed, his wife went to the Camp Pendleton Hospital, induced pregnancy, and his child was born. And so that child and his wife will have to grow up without Derek. And there are unfortunately tens of thousands of stories like that as a result of our wars. And, I don't think that a lot of those stories are permanently kind of seared in people's minds because, one, I just think, this is a broader cultural issue, that we just have shorter attention spans, but they've been confined to a fewer number of communities. And this is something else I talk about in the chapter, is that our military recruiting comes from fewer and fewer places and from fewer and fewer groups of Americans. One of the largest sources of recruits, I think, probably on like a per capita basis, is military families. So they're coming out of the same communities in fewer and fewer parts of the country. So the costs are isolated to these communities, but they are paying the price dearly. And so, towns and cities around large military installations, you feel it more than you would say in, like Manhattan or in San Francisco. It's not to say that there weren't people from those places that deployed and served honorably in our wars, but the costs are more concentrated. And more and more of the American population, as a result, is not only shielded from those costs, but it's less visible to them as a result of who is now filling the ranks of our military.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Every chapter in Pro-Child Politics will follow a pretty similar theme. It will share about a child that's been impacted. There will be a series of lies identified and then a series of truths identified. So I'd love to go into those a little bit. One of the lies that you identify is that realism and restraint would mean isolationism. And so it seems like, to, again, more of a lay person, I don't know that much about foreign policy. There's the idea of where we are the world's police. If we're the most powerful, we need to kind of maintain power by brute strength. If there's a problem somewhere, we need to go over there and fix it, or kind of try to set up a democracy or help free people. And that's the world's police, maybe, side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum, maybe the other extreme, is the idea of isolationist or isolationism, meaning don't do or worry about anybody else other than America. No American troops die for anybody else ever. And you are saying that there's some middle ground there, and that would be realism and restraint. So can you go into a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah. So on the isolationism point, I honestly have to say is there's hardly anybody of any consequence. There really isn't anybody of real impact or power who is a true isolationist in the United States. It's used as a smear against anyone like myself, somebody like Donald Trump or JD Vance or Rand Paul or Mike Lee, who questions our foreign policy status quo. And it is a smear used by people that in most cases have been wrong about everything regarding American foreign policy the last 30 years. So almost no one has any impact on the foreign policy debate, either on the outside as an advocate or as a policy scholar or as a policy maker, is a true isolationist. So almost everybody acknowledges that there needs to be some level of American engagement with the world and that we need to have a military that can project power around the world. It's to what level and what you prioritize is the real debate. And so the real dominant view still, and it's getting challenged in a way that it hasn't been before, is that the United States needs to be the global policeman or pursue something called primacy, where the United States is not just simply the most powerful country in the world. I want them to be the most powerful country in the world, but we need to dominate the world. And we need to dominate the world to implement liberal hegemony and essentially oppose liberal values, and not in the classical sense, but in the progressive sense, on the rest of the world, because that will help the world. And liberalism is this universal set of values that everybody deep inside they're just a liberal wanting to burst out. I think somebody who was an advocate of the Iraq War, essentially said that every Iraqi and every Afghan, there's a Thomas Jefferson inside them ready to come out, and that's nonsense. I believe I'm a classical liberal. I believe in liberal values, but I also recognize that liberalism is an ideology you can impose in a top-down manner. And that trying to do that over the last 20 years has not made the United States safer. So what's the alternative? Well, it's a foreign policy of realism and restraint. Realism in the sense that we recognize the world as it is and that we have limited ability to change it outside of the United States. And it's not really in our interest to try and reshape the world in our interest. And that we need to prioritize our interests like other countries do, is that we should lead with American interests in what is best for our safety in the conditions of our economic prosperity. And that is stuff that again directly threatens our physical safety and what enables us to be prosperous. And that's actually not as broad a set of interests as some people will tell you. And restraint, in the sense that we recognize that America is very powerful, but there's still limits on that power. We have limited financial, military, and industrial capacity, and we need to conserve that power. And that one of our most important tools is our military, but we should not be using that as the first resort. It should always be the last resort. And instead, in a lot of cases, we need to lean on more non-military tools of American statecraft, whether it's diplomacy or economic or even just cultural engagement. So that is not an ideology that calls for the United States to pull back and to disconnect from the world. It recognizes the world as it is and fundamentally recenters American foreign policy on what is best for the American people and the future of our country.
Yeah.
And it's a break from this utopian ideology that has dominated American foreign policy making across both Republican and Democrat administrations since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting to think that it's not really as much red and blue as maybe we tend to think, or that it's portrayed in the media. It does seem like both sides of the American political spectrum are kind of aligned, because the same things keep happening, whether it doesn't really matter which president is in. But I think you made a distinction in your chapter between some things that Reagan was doing correctly and some things Trump was doing correctly, which people, you should go pre-order the book, because we can't get into everything in just one conversation. One truth that you identified that it really got me thinking was that America should have a stronger military in fewer places. So can you talk a little bit about that and maybe just give us some practical examples of what that would look like?
So, I believe in a restrained foreign policy. I believe the United States needs to have a strong military. The primary function of a government, in my view, is to provide safety. And we should have a military second to none. And despite all our spending on the military, despite all these wars, our military in many ways is in a very bad position. We have not invested in things that we need to keep America safe in the current world. Primarily, we've neglected things like our Navy. Our Navy's actually shrinking despite record levels of defense spending. It's because we prioritize building an army to fight these counterinsurgency and nation building conflicts for so long. We neglected our Navy. We canceled shipbuilding projects. We shrunk the size of the Navy. Same thing with the Air Force. We cut the number of combat planes, primarily to pay for an army to fight these counterinsurgency conflicts over 20 years. And additionally, we've deployed our military to places where there are not vital American national interests at stake. And one very glaring example of that is Eastern Europe. The United States has overcommitted to Europe. And yes, the Russians invaded Ukraine, and it was a war of aggression. The Russians had no real justification to invade Ukraine. We can discuss how we got to that point and mistakes the United States made, but that doesn't mean that the Russians are the good guys in Ukraine. I want to be clear on that. However, the reality is that there are more European interests at stake in Ukraine than there are American ones. And because the United States has doubled down in Europe and sent all these troops and we're spending all this money in Ukraine, an incredibly wealthy and rich Europe, which has 10 times the GDP of Russia and 4 times the population, is still largely free riding off America's security umbrella. And that instead of using the money and resources we're investing in Europe to fix our Navy, which we're going to need in the Pacific, if God forbid there's a war in China, we're still investing in army units and things that we need primarily for Europe. So it's a combination of deploying our forces to the wrong places, mainly Europe, but also the Middle East, and then investing in the wrong weapon systems and force structure. And so to sum it all up is I think we need to prioritize investing in a strong Navy and Air Force over a big land army. And I just point out, this is actually something that our founding fathers believe. They in the Constitution, they talk about specifically funding a Navy and then raising an army if there's a war. And America primarily needs to be a maritime power, not a land power.
Yeah.
And so that's I think the change we need to think about in investing in a strong military. And that doesn't mean just investing in a certain top line defense spending number or a certain size. It's capabilities geared towards actual threats, not inflated threats.
Yeah, that's really good. Yes, there's just so many things I think most of us will not really have thought about that you bring up in your chapter. So I'm really excited for people to be able to read it because, yeah, we kind of just make our foreign policy decisions based off, whether you go off CNN or Fox News or whatever, or more independent media, it's really helpful to have people who've been more on the ground and have seen some of the things that work. Final question for you, because we want to connect everything to the rights of children, to the well-being of children. And that's what this book will do. Take every topic and try to highlight how it hurts children to do it wrong and it will help children to do it right. It seems like you really connect foreign policy to fiscal policy. That it seemed like let's see, you said one way that bad foreign policy hurts kids, obviously, is that American kids can lose their parents or their parents are gone or their parents are injured. So that's a big deal. Then you've got, of course, kids around the world when they are in a place that's at war based on our foreign policies. That's negatively impacting children for sure. But it seemed like the biggest thing you made a point of is that our bad foreign policy with spending and wasting money and endless wars, etc., that's hurting kids because of debt and wasting money and kind of, borrowing from their future to try and deal with things right now. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So throughout American history, war has been the biggest driver in the growth in government, the size of government and the power of government. And wars are incredibly expensive. And not just paying for a military, but also investing in, veterans benefits to take care of veterans who are wounded or hurt in military service. Investing in, rebuilding some of these countries through foreign aid programs, or they're run for the military or State Department, or as you said, CIA and other government agencies. The global war on terror, and I think I referenced this in the chapter, is on track to have added $10 trillion to our national debt. In addition, at home, being in a permanent state of war incentivizes the government to gain more power, to do things like increase the surveillance state, to increase the budgets of certain law enforcement organizations, to worry about foreign threats, connected to our enemies abroad, which in a lot of cases, our foreign policy has multiplied our enemies abroad. There are more jihadis today than there were on 9/11, in part because of how we've prosecuted the war on terror. So it all feeds into each other. And then you get this dynamic in Congress where you have the Republican hawks teaming up with the Democrat progressives to cut these deals, or we're going to increase the military budget, but we're also going to increase the size of the welfare state. And that further adds to the cost of government and to our national debt, which of course is imperiling our financial future and risking, financial ruin for our children. It's not a coincidence that you've had some military leaders like the former Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, and General James Mattis, and many others say our greatest long-term threat isn't China, isn't Iran, it isn't Russia. It's our own national debt, right, which has the capability to destroy our economic engine and the sources of our prosperity. So you can't ignore the cost of our foreign policy and the impact it's had on our debt. And that's why, to be a little provocative here, you can't be a true fiscal conservative and be somebody who believes that we should be the world's policeman. They just cannot work together.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Oh, it's great. Lots of good things to think about. This conversation will come out, I think, pretty soon, but people will still have time to pre-order. So it's still going to be a little bit before they can get the book in their hands. But we're so thankful that you contributed a chapter and people will have this in their hands before the election, because we want people to be informed about the topics and think of it from the perspective of children first. So thanks so much, Dan, for your chapter and your time today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the Them Before Us podcast. Pre-order your book, Pro Child Politics, today. And thanks for joining the movement.